Elizaveta always imagined a life full of comfort and warmth. In her dreams, she saw a spacious, sunlit kitchen where she and her loved one would cook dinner together, laugh at something insignificant, and feel like the happiest people in the world. For her, family was something sacred, unshakable. She believed that love could overcome everything. And when she married Sergei 3 years ago, it seemed to her that her dreams were becoming reality. Their wedding was modest, but very touching. She still remembered how Sergei looked at her when she walked towards him arm in arm with her father. His eyes shone with love. His smile was full of promise. Then she believed that they would always be happy. She believed that he would be her support, her pillar, her best friend. The first months of their life together were truly wonderful. They lived in a small apartment that Sergei rented especially for them. Elizaveta furnished every corner with love. She chose curtains, selected dishes, bought cute trinkets so that their home would become truly cozy. She tried to surprise Sergei by cooking new dishes and was sincerely happy with each of his compliments. And he seemed to appreciate it. He laughed, talked about his dreams, promised that one day they would move to a big house with a garden. But this idyll began to collapse when their mother-in-law, Nadezhda Sergeyevna, began to interfere more and more in their daily life. Elizaveta noticed that her look was unkind from the very beginning, but she attributed this to maternal jealousy and tried to be nice. She cooked her mother-in-law's favorite dishes, invited her to visit, tried to build a warm relationship. But with each new meeting, it became more and more obvious. Nadezhda Sergeyevna was not going to accept her. His mother-in-law could call Sergei at any time, and their conversations always boiled down to one thing. "Are you sure she can handle it? Did you eat normally today? Is it clean there?" These questions sounded like a reproach to Elizaveta. But the real problem was that Nadezhda Sergeyevna began to come without warning. She appeared on the threshold at the most inopportune moments, when Elizaveta was tired after work and just wanted to rest, or when she and Sergei were planning to spend the evening together. "Why is it so dusty?" she asked, barely crossing the threshold. "Elizaveta, do you at least sometimes wash the windows? And what kind of dinner is this? My son won't eat this." These words cut like a blade. Elizaveta remained silent, clenching her fists to keep from crying. She knew that any reaction on her part would only make the situation worse. Sergei, however, seemed unaware of how much all this was hurting her. Moreover, he was making excuses for his mother. "She means well," he would say when Elizabeth tried to share her feelings. "She cares about us. You just take things too seriously." But she knew it wasn't just concern. It was control. Control that was getting stronger. One day, when Nadezhda Sergeyevna arrived again without warning, Elizaveta simply could not stand it. It had been a long day, full of worries. She spent several hours at work, then stopped by the store to buy groceries for dinner. She dreamed of only one thing: to lie down on the sofa and rest a little. But as soon as she entered the apartment, she heard her mother-in-law's voice. "Where have you been for so long? Sergei said you were late. Your kitchen is a mess. How do you even cope?" Elizaveta felt everything boiling inside. Her hands shook as she put the bags on the table. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words got stuck in her throat. Instead, she forced a smile and went to the bedroom to calm down. But inside, she was only despair. She felt like a little girl who was always scolded, who would never be good enough. Sergei, as usual, sided with his mother. "Mom's right, Lisa," he said later. "You need to be more attentive. It's not that hard to clean or cook a normal meal." Those words were the last straw for her. She looked at him and couldn't believe that the man who swore to love and protect her was saying that. Every time she tried to tell him how hard it was for her, he brushed it off. Her feelings didn't matter to him. He chose not to notice that she was trying so hard to please both him and his mother. And this crack in their relationship was getting deeper. Elizabeth felt like her life was turning into a prison. Her home, which was supposed to be a place of comfort and love, had become a source of pain and humiliation for her. She could no longer be herself. Her world was narrowing, filling with despair and guilt. But she didn't know then that all this was just the beginning. He chose not to notice that she was trying so hard to please both him and his mother. And this crack in their relationship was becoming deeper. Elizabeth felt like her life was turning into a prison. Her home, which was supposed to be a place of comfort and love, became a source of pain and humiliation for her. She could no longer be herself. Her world was narrowing, filled with despair and guilt. But then she did not know that all this was only the beginning. He chose not to notice that she was trying so hard to please both him and his mother. And this crack in their relationship was becoming deeper. Elizabeth felt like her life was turning into a prison. Her home, which was supposed to be a place of comfort and love, became a source of pain and humiliation for her. She could no longer be herself. Her world was narrowing, filled with despair and guilt. But then she did not know that all this was only the beginning. From that evening, when Nadezhda Sergeyevna first openly reproached Elizaveta for her failure as a housewife, the tension in the house began to grow with redoubled force. Now their family dinners were more like exams. Each time the mother-in-law looked at the prepared dish with disdain, looking for a reason to make comments. "Sergey likes borscht thicker. Can't you learn to cook it properly?" It seemed that she did not miss a single opportunity to offend Elizaveta. Each of her comments was like a hammer blow on the fragile glass of patience. Elizaveta tried to hold on. She nodded with a smile, agreed, pretended that it did not bother her. But inside, everything was boiling. Sergey, as always, took the position of a silent observer. Her soul was torn between love for her husband and hatred for this constant criticism. One evening, when Elizaveta returned home after a particularly hard day at work, she was met with Sergey's cold gaze. Nadezhda Sergeyevna was sitting at the kitchen table again, holding a cup of tea. Liza noticed that there were already folded pieces of paper on the table with her rough plans for the next day, which she had forgotten to put away. "What's this?" her mother-in-law began, picking up the piece of paper. "Are you thinking about work and not about home? Sergey told me that your house is dusty again." Her voice was enveloped in cloying concern, which only increased the humiliation. "My dear, you must understand. Work is good, but what kind of wife is she if the house is such a mess?" Elizaveta felt a wave of despair rise inside her. She quickly glanced at Sergey, hoping that he would stand up for her. But he only stood silently, as if agreeing with every word his mother said. "I'm trying," she said, trying to remain calm. Her voice was quiet, but there was pain in it. "You don't understand how hard it is for me. I'm trying to please everyone, but it's impossible." Nadezhda Sergeyevna shrugged and looked at her son. "Sergey, I told you she can't cope. Maybe she should spend less time on her ambitions and more time on her family?" These words were like a knife in the heart. Liza looked at them both and felt tears starting to gather in the corners of her eyes. She could no longer hold back. "Why are you silent?" She turned to her husband. "Do you see what's happening? Why don't you say anything?" Sergey sighed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Lisa, you're making things more difficult. Mom just wants to help. Why can't you listen?" These words hit her hard. She looked at Sergey and couldn't believe that the man who had once promised to protect her was saying this. "Help?" She laughed bitterly. "You call this help? No, it's humiliation. Every visit from you reminds me that I'll never be good enough in your eyes." "Liza, you're exaggerating," Sergey replied coldly. "You just don't want to change." These words sounded like a final verdict. Elizabeth felt her strength leaving her. She could no longer hold back her tears. Her heart sank with pain, and her throat tightened so much that it became difficult to breathe. She turned abruptly and walked out of the room, slamming the bedroom door behind her. That night, she lay in the darkness for a long time, unable to sleep. Her thoughts raced between anger, pain, and helplessness. She remembered how she and Sergei had started their life together, how he had said that she was the most important thing to him, how he had promised to protect her. But now, it all seemed like a lie. Sergei was no longer the man she loved. He had become a stranger, a man who saw her not as a partner, but as a not good enough wife. The next day, she tried to talk to Sergei, hoping that perhaps during the night he had realized how hard it was for her. But the conversation again became a cold formality. "Sergei, I can't do this anymore," she began, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. Her voice was shaking, but she tried to be firm. "This is not life. This is some kind of nightmare." "Liza, you make everything difficult," he said without looking up. "We are a family, and Mom is a part of our family. She wants everything to be good, and you perceive her words as an attack." "An attack?" Her voice rose, but she immediately pulled herself together. "Sergei, you have no idea what it's like to hear every day that you are a bad wife, that you do everything wrong, and to hear it not only from your mom, but from you too." He looked at her with incomprehension, shook his head. "You are just too emotional, Liza. I think you need to calm down." Her breathing became intermittent. These words were the last straw. She silently got up from the table and left the apartment without looking back. She walked down the street in the rain, not noticing how her face was wet not only from the raindrops, but also from tears. She couldn't stand it anymore. Elizaveta stopped on the bridge, leaning on the railing. She looked at the dark water and felt despair rising inside her. But along with it, she began to feel something new. The knowledge that she no longer had to endure the humiliation. And you perceive her words as an attack. An attack? Her voice rose, but she immediately pulled herself together. "Sergei, you can't even imagine what it's like to hear every day that you're a bad wife, that you do everything wrong, and to hear it not only from your mother, but from you too." He looked at her with incomprehension, shook his head. "You're just too emotional, Lisa. I think you need to calm down." Her breathing became intermittent. These words were the last straw. She silently got up from the table and left the apartment without looking back. She walked down the street in the rain, not noticing how her face was wet not only from the raindrops, but also from tears. She couldn't stand it anymore. Elizaveta stopped on the bridge, leaning her elbows on the railing. She looked at the dark water and felt despair rising inside her. But with him, she began to feel something new. It was the realization that she no longer had to endure humiliation. And you perceive her words as an attack. An attack? Her voice rose, but she immediately pulled herself together. "Sergei, you can't even imagine what it's like to hear every day that you're a bad wife, that you do everything wrong, and to hear it not only from your mother, but from you too." He looked at her with incomprehension, shook his head. "You're just too emotional, Lisa. I think you need to calm down." Her breathing became intermittent. These words were the last straw. She silently got up from the table and left the apartment without looking back. She walked down the street in the rain, not noticing how her face was wet not only from raindrops, but also from tears. She couldn't stand it anymore. Elizaveta stopped on the bridge, leaning her elbows on the railing. She looked at the dark water and felt despair rising inside her. But with him, she began to feel something new. It was the realization that she no longer had to endure humiliation. The night she made the decision to leave, Elizabeth felt like her soul was being torn apart. She sat for a long time in the darkness of her bedroom, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring into space. A whirlwind of thoughts swirled in her head: resentment, pain, fear of the future. But amidst this chaos, one clear idea emerged. I can't live like this anymore. These words, so simple and direct, became an anchor for her. They kept her from drowning in endless thoughts about whether she was doing the right thing. The morning came quietly, but it brought a strange feeling of clarity. She woke up early, not because she wanted to, but because thoughts filled her mind again. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, but it did not warm her. Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed, holding her phone in her hands. Sergei's number was displayed on the screen, but she did not dial it. What could she say to him? What should she say? She felt that words were useless now. It was all too obvious. Their relationship was broken. The solution came unexpectedly simply. She took out of the closet the suitcase she had once bought for their honeymoon. Back then, it had been a symbol of the beginning of their family life, and now it had become a symbol of her freedom. Elizaveta began to pack her things. At first, she took only the bare necessities: clothes, documents, cosmetics. But then her gaze fell on the bookshelf. There were the novels she loved to read. Her hand froze before taking one of the books. She remembered how many times she had put them aside for the sake of household chores, for the sake of living up to Sergei's expectations. That moment seemed to confirm her decision. She no longer wanted to live for someone else. Everything she put in the suitcase was filled with memories. There was her favorite vase, which they had bought together at the fair. There was a photograph from their first trip to the sea. Everything was imbued with what they had built together. But now those memories no longer brought her joy. They hurt, reminding him of how everything had fallen apart. When she had packed her suitcase, she left it by the door and went back into the bedroom. Her gaze fell on the wedding ring lying on the nightstand. She had taken it off a few days ago, when she felt that this symbol no longer meant anything. Elizaveta looked at it for a long time, and then, without hesitation, put the ring in a small box and put it away in a drawer. It was no longer a part of her life. In the evening, when Sergei returned home, the apartment greeted him with a strange silence. Elizaveta was sitting in the kitchen, a cup of tea in front of her. Her face was calm, but there was a hardness in her eyes that he had not seen before. Her suitcase was on the floor. "Liza, what's going on?" he asked, frowning. His voice was more irritated than worried. She looked up, trying not to show her emotions. The storm was still raging inside, but she decided that this conversation should be calm. "I'm leaving, Sergei. I can't do this anymore." His face changed. Surprise and anger were mixed on it. "You're leaving? Because of what?" He spoke quickly, almost forcefully. "Because of Mom?" "That's stupid, Lisa. We can talk about it. We can work it out. You can't just throw it all away." She sighed, feeling her heart squeeze at his words. Not long ago, she would have run to him, explaining that she was in pain, that she was having a hard time. But now everything had changed. "It's not because of your mother, Sergei," she answered quietly. "It's because of us. We lost what we had between us. I don't feel like your wife anymore. I feel like a servant who will never be good enough." His eyes flashed with irritation. "It's all your emotions, Lisa. You're being overly dramatic. You just don't want to work on our relationship." She shook her head. "I tried to work, Sergei. I tried to be good for you, for your mother, for everyone. But I'm not in that equation. I don't want to fight for respect anymore. I'm tired." His gaze hardened. He took a step closer to her, but she raised her hand, indicating that the conversation was over. "You'll regret this, Liza," he said coldly. She felt her heart tighten, but she let it go. "Perhaps. But it will be my decision, Sergei. For the first time in a long time. I'm choosing myself." When the door closed behind her, she felt a strange relief, as if the heavy burden she had carried on her shoulders for 3 years had suddenly disappeared. The night air was cold, but it brought with it a feeling of freedom. She walked down the street, holding onto her suitcase, and felt something new begin to form in her heart. It was pain mixed with hope, the pain of loss, but also the hope that a new, free life awaited her, mixed with hope. The pain of loss, but also the hope that a new, free life awaits her ahead, mixed with hope. The pain of loss, but also the hope that a new, free life awaits her ahead. The morning in the small apartment began with a quiet, barely perceptible melody from the radio. Elizaveta sat on the windowsill, clutching a cup of coffee. Her gaze wandered over the sky outside the window, which was beginning to turn the pastel shades of dawn. It seemed like an ordinary morning, unremarkable. But for her, it had become a symbol. She no longer lived in a house that suffocated her with its tension. Now she lived only for herself. A week had passed since she left Sergei. The memories of that day were still fresh, like a wound that had just begun to heal. The evening when she packed her suitcase and left their apartment was still before her eyes. She remembered how Sergei looked at her, either with resentment or with incomprehension. His words, "You will regret this," echoed in her head. But despite this, she did not feel regret. There was something else. A feeling of liberation, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. At first, it had been difficult. The small apartment she had moved into seemed unusually quiet. No footsteps, no calls from Nadezhda Sergeyevna, no irritated comments. This silence was both calming and frightening. Elizaveta realized that she was truly alone now. No one would come to her aid. No one would tell her how to live on. All she had was herself. She started with something simple. She tidied up her new home. With each thing she put away, Elizaveta felt like she was putting herself back together. The book she loved but hadn't opened for a long time now lay on the bedside table. The old blanket, smelling of coziness, reminded her again that she was home. She put the bright flowers she had bought at the market along the way in a vase. It was a small but important beginning to her new life. But with these changes came doubts. At night, when the city fell asleep, she lay in the dark and remembered the moments that were happy. How Sergei hugged her when she was sad. How they laughed at something silly while cooking dinner together. She caught herself thinking that she missed these moments. But then she reminded herself how much pain there was between these happy moments. It wasn't love, she told herself. It was a fight. One of the most difficult days was her first day at work after the move. Her colleagues knew about her divorce, but they tried not to bring it up. Only her boss, Elena, an older woman with piercing eyes, stopped her in the hallway. "Liza, you're doing well," she said, looking into her eyes. "But you know you don't have to be strong all the time. If you want to talk, I'm here." The words caught her off guard. She nodded, holding back her tears with difficulty, and went into her office. Only after she closed the door behind her did she allow herself to cry a little. These were not tears of weakness, but tears of relief. For the first time, she felt that she was not alone in this world. A few more weeks passed, and Elizabeth began to get used to the new rhythm of life. She realized that loneliness was not a punishment, but an opportunity. She began to do something she had been putting off for a long time. On the weekend, she bought paints and canvases that had been sitting in her closet for almost 3 years. She set up her easel by the window, and for the first time in a long time, her hands picked up her brushes again. As she mixed the paints, she felt something long forgotten awakening inside her. Each line on the canvas was filled with emotions that she had been holding back for so long. Her first painting was strange, almost abstract. It mixed bright, almost screaming colors with dark, disturbing shades. It was not just a painting. It was her soul, laid out on canvas. When she finished, she stared at it for a long time, trying to comprehend what she had just created. This was the beginning of her healing. One evening, she received a message from Anna, an old friend. "Lisa, I haven't seen you in ages. You need to get out of your shell. Come to the exhibition on Saturday. It will change your mood. Elizaveta stared at the screen for a long time, wondering whether she should go. She was no longer used to noisy companies, but something inside pushed her to agree. On the day of the exhibition, she put on her favorite dress, light, bright, which had long been gathering dust in the closet. When she entered the hall, she was overcome by an amazing feeling. She felt alive again. There were paintings on the walls, each of which was imbued with other people's emotions, other people's stories. She walked along the walls, looking at the canvases, and suddenly stopped. In front of her was a painting depicting a lighthouse surrounded by a raging sea. A storm raged around it, but it stood, proudly shining into the darkness. Elizaveta stared at this lighthouse for a long time. It reminded her of itself. She was this lighthouse. Her life was a storm, but she withstood it, found the strength to remain steadfast. At that moment, she realized that all the trials had made her stronger than she could have imagined. When she got home, she sat down at her easel and began to paint her lighthouse. Her hands no longer shook, and her lines were confident. She painted the light that broke through the storm, and she felt her heart fill with light. This was her new chapter, the chapter where she finally became the master of her life. This will change your mood. Elizaveta looked at the screen for a long time, wondering whether she should go. She was no longer used to noisy companies, but something inside pushed her to agree. On the day of the exhibition, she put on her favorite dress, light, bright, which had long been gathering dust in the closet. When she entered the hall, she was overcome by an amazing feeling. She felt alive again. Paintings hung on the walls, each of which was imbued with other people's emotions, other people's stories. She walked along the walls, looking at the canvases, and suddenly stopped. In front of her was a painting depicting a lighthouse surrounded by a raging sea. A storm raged around it, but it stood, proudly shining into the darkness. Elizaveta looked at this lighthouse for a long time. It reminded her of itself. She was this lighthouse. Her life was a storm, but she stood firm, found the strength to remain steadfast. At that moment, she realized that all the trials had made more than she could have imagined. When she got home, she sat down at her easel and began to paint her lighthouse. Her hands no longer shook, and her lines were confident. She painted the light shining through the storm, and she felt her heart fill with light. This was her new chapter, the chapter where she finally became the master of her life. This will change your mood. Elizaveta looked at the screen for a long time, wondering whether she should go. She was no longer used to noisy companies, but something inside pushed her to agree. On the day of the exhibition, she put on her favorite dress, light, bright, which had long been gathering dust in the closet. When she entered the hall, she was overcome by an amazing feeling. She felt alive again. Paintings hung on the walls, each of which was imbued with other people's emotions, other people's stories. She walked along the walls, looking at the canvases, and suddenly stopped. In front of her was a painting depicting a lighthouse surrounded by a raging sea. A storm raged around it, but it stood, proudly shining into the darkness. Elizaveta looked at this lighthouse for a long time. It reminded her of itself. She was this lighthouse. Her life was a storm, but she stood firm, found the strength to remain steadfast. At that moment, she realized that all the trials had made more than she could have imagined. When she got home, she sat down at her easel and began to paint her lighthouse. Her hands no longer shook, and her lines were confident. She painted the light shining through the storm, and she felt her heart fill with light. This was her new chapter, the chapter where she finally became the master of her life. The painting of the lighthouse took its place in the center of her small apartment. Elizaveta often looked at it as a reminder of what she had been through and how she found the strength to start all over again. It was not just a lighthouse, it was herself, resilient, proud, shining, despite all the storms. Several months had passed since she left Sergei. Every day became a small step towards a new life for her. Work was no longer just a way to earn money. It became an outlet for her. Elizaveta began to invest more creativity, energy, and ideas into it. Her boss, Elena, noticed this and invited her to take part in a new project related to interior design. Elizaveta agreed without hesitation. Working with a team of designers inspired her, and each completed project brought joy and self-confidence. Her creativity also began to gain momentum. Her friend Anna helped organize a small exhibition in an art cafe. Elizaveta hesitated for a long time whether to show her works, but eventually she decided to do so. The opening evening became an important event for her. She stood among her paintings and listened to visitors discuss her works. Some admired the brightness of the colors, others, the depth of emotions embedded in each canvas. One of the guests, a man in glasses with gray temples, came up to her and said, "Your paintings are amazing." They seemed to say, "I survived the storm, but kept the light. You are a talented person." These words touched her to the depths of her soul. Elizaveta thanked him, feeling a quiet but confident feeling of pride blossom inside her. She was no longer just a wife. Now she was herself. An artist, an individual, a person who was able to go through pain and find the strength to move forward. Her life gradually filled with new colors. She began to meet with friends more often, go to exhibitions, travel around the neighborhoods in search of inspiration. One day, on one of these walks, she met a man who, like her, was looking for solitude in nature. His name was Alexei. He was a photographer who traveled around cities and created photo projects about people and their stories. Their conversation began with a discussion of art, but soon they moved on to more personal topics. Alexei turned out to be kind, attentive, and sincere. He did not ask unnecessary questions, did not try to impose his opinion. He listened, and in this attention, Elizaveta found what she had been missing before. They began to communicate more and more often. Elizaveta was in no hurry to build a new relationship. She valued her freedom and did not want to lose herself again. But Alexei did not try to fill her life with himself. He respected her space, her choices. Over time, she realized that she felt comfortable with him. They could be silent for hours, walking in the park, or discuss creativity over a cup of coffee. Their relationship was easy, free from pressure and expectations. A year passed. Elizabeth looked at her painting of the lighthouse, which now adorned the wall of her apartment. It had been a long and difficult journey, but she was proud to have completed it. Her life was no longer subject to other people's demands or fears. Now she lived the way she wanted, and that was her personal victory. She had not forgotten Sergei and their past. Sometimes she would remember those moments that were happy, but she no longer felt pain. It was part of her history, but it no longer determined her future. She understood that their marriage had taught her an important lesson: to learn to value herself and her boundaries. It was an experience that helped her become who she was now. The day Alexei gave her his first photograph, a portrait of her taken while she was drawing by the window, she smiled. The picture captured a woman filled with light and confidence. She saw herself in her a new Elizaveta, who had found her happiness within herself.